The amber liquid burned down Zethkar's throat as he set the glass down with trembling claws. Around him, the cantina buzzed with the usual chatter of mercenaries, traders, and soldiers from across the galaxy. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the old Krillian warrior couldn't shake the memories that had been haunting him for cycles. Another round, veteran? The bartender, a four-armed Nexian, gestured toward Zethkar's empty glass. Zethkar nodded, his scarred hide rippling under the dim lights. The new recruits at the corner table were boasting about their upcoming deployment to the Outer Rim, their voices full of bravado and ignorance. They had no idea what real war looked like. They had never faced humans. A young Vorthon approached his table, her blue scales gleaming with polish that marked her as fresh out of the academy. "Excuse me, sir. Aren't you Zethkar the Unbreakable, the hero of the Centauri campaign?" Zethkar's laugh was bitter. "Hero? Is that what they're calling me now?" He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit, young one. Let me tell you what they don't teach in your war colleges." The recruit's eyes widened with excitement as she settled into the chair. "I've read about your victories, sir. 47 battles without a single defeat. You're a legend among the fleet." 46, Zethkar corrected, his voice growing distant. 46 victories. The 47th, he took another drink. The 47th was against humans. The Vorthon leaned forward eagerly. "But the records show you won that engagement too." The Battle of Kepler Station was listed as a decisive victory for the Galactic Alliance. Zethkar's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement or despair. Decisive victory. Yes, that's what the reports say. That's what they always say when they need to hide the truth. He stared into his drink, watching the liquid swirl like the void of space. "Tell me, recruit, what do you know about humans?" "They're a recently discovered species from the Sol system," she recited dutifully. "Technologically inferior but showing promise. They've been granted associate membership in the Alliance pending further evaluation." "Technologically inferior," Zethkar repeated. "That's what we thought too. That's what our intelligence report said. That's what got my entire battalion killed." The cantina's noise seemed to fade as Zethkar's words hung in the air. The young Vorthon's excitement dimmed, replaced by confusion and growing unease. "I was a different being then," Zethkar continued. "Proud, arrogant. I commanded the 47th Assault Division, the finest warriors the Krillian Empire had ever produced. We were tasked with securing Kepler Station, a mining outpost that had fallen under human control during their expansion into contested space." He paused, his claws tracing old scars along his arm. The briefing was simple. Humans were soft, they said, weak creatures who had barely crawled out of their gravity well. They had numbers, but no real military tradition. No understanding of true warfare. It would be a simple matter of overwhelming force. The recruit shifted uncomfortably. "But sir, if they were so weak, how did they break the unbreakable?" Zethkar's laugh was harsh. "That's what you want to know, isn't it? How a species that had only achieved faster than light travel 50 cycles ago managed to turn the greatest military force in the quadrant into scattered atoms and nightmares." He drained his glass and signaled for another. The Nexian bartender approached with obvious reluctance, having overheard enough to know this was not a conversation he wanted to be part of. "We jumped into the Kepler system with confidence," Zethkar resumed. 3 heavy cruisers, 12 destroyers, and my flagship, the inevitable Dawn. 6,000 of the finest warriors in the galaxy. Against what? A mining station and maybe a few patrol boats? The memories came flooding back despite his efforts to suppress them. The tactical display showing the human ships scattered and fleeing. The easy pursuit. "The trap they ran," he said quietly. "As soon as we entered the system, they ran. Exactly what we expected from a species with no warrior culture. We gave chase, of course. It was our duty to ensure none escaped to spread word of our operation." The Vorthon was hanging on every word now, her academic excitement replaced by something deeper, fear perhaps, or recognition that the comfortable certainties of her training were about to crumble. The humans had 7 ships. Small things, barely larger than our fighters. Primitive plasma drives, basic shields, kinetic weapons that belonged in a museum. Our scanner showed maybe 200 life signs total. It should have been a slaughter. Zethkar's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. It was. The silence stretched between them as other conversations died around their table. Even the hardened mercenaries and veterans had stopped their chatter to listen. "But sir," the recruit finally managed, "if you won the battle..." "Won?" Zethkar's mandibles spread in what his species used for a bitter smile. Child, let me teach you the first lesson about fighting humans. Victory and survival are not the same thing. I survived the Battle of Kepler Station. That does not mean I won. He stood slowly, his movements carrying the weight of cycles worth of nightmares. The humans taught me something that day. Something that every warrior in this galaxy needs to understand if we're going to share space with them. The Vorthan looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. What did they teach you? Zethkar placed a scarred claw on her shoulder. They taught me that there are fates worse than death, and that sometimes the species you think you're hunting is actually hunting you. With that, he turned and walked toward the cantina's exit, leaving the young recruit staring after him. Behind him, conversation slowly resumed, but the mood had changed. Word would spread as it always did in places like this. Another veteran telling war stories. Another old soldier drowning his sorrows. But those who had been listening closely, those who had seen real combat, they would remember his words. And perhaps when they next encountered humans in battle, they would be better prepared for what they were truly facing. The automatic doors sealed behind Zethkar as he stepped into the station's corridor, leaving behind the warmth and noise of the cantina. In the cold, recycled air of the passageway, surrounded by the distant hum of life support systems, he allowed himself to remember what he had never spoken aloud. The humans had let him survive, and that more than any defeat was what terrified him most. 3 days passed before Zethkar returned to the cantina. He told himself it was just another drinking establishment, nothing special about it. But his feet had carried him here nonetheless, drawn by something he couldn't name. Perhaps it was the memory of the young Vorthan's terrified eyes. Perhaps it was the weight of secrets that grew heavier with each passing cycle. The cantina was busier tonight. A new shipment of mercenaries had arrived, fresh contracts in hand and credits burning holes in their pockets. Zethkar found his usual table in the corner, noting with grim satisfaction that it had remained empty. Even hardened killers had their superstitions. He was 3 drinks in when she appeared again. The Vorthan recruit, but different now. The Polish was gone from her scales, replaced by a dullness that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult questions. She approached hesitantly as if afraid he might vanish like smoke. "Permission to sit, sir?" Her voice was quieter than before, respectful in a way that had nothing to do with military protocol. Zethkar gestured to the chair. "You've been thinking about what I said. It wasn't a question." He could see it in her posture, the way her hands trembled slightly as she folded them on the table. The comfortable certainties of youth had been shaken, and now she was seeking something to replace them. "I looked up the battle records," she said carefully. "The official ones. You're right, they do say decisive victory. But I also found casualty reports, medical transfers, pension claims. And what did those tell you? That 6,000 warriors went to Kepler Station. Only 800 came back. And most of those," she swallowed hard, "most of those were classified as psychological casualties. Unfit for active duty." Zethkar nodded slowly. "Smart girl. You're learning to read between the lines. That's a skill that might keep you alive." He signaled the bartender for another round. "What else did you find?" "Nothing. That's what scared me. After Kepler Station, it's like the humans just disappeared from the records. No more engagements. No diplomatic contact, nothing. Because after Kepler Station, the Galactic Council made a decision," Zethkar said. "They classified humans as a protected species. No military contact without explicit authorization from the High Command. Do you know why?" The Vorthan shook her head, though her expression suggested she was beginning to suspect. "Because we finally understood what we were dealing with," Zethkar continued. "Not a weak species to be conquered or absorbed. Something else entirely. Something that didn't fit our models of warfare or civilization." He took a long drink, gathering the courage to speak words he had never said aloud. "Would you like to know what really happened at Kepler Station? Not the sanitized version in the reports, but the truth?" She nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes. "We chased those 7 ships for 6 hours, Zethkar began. Standard pursuit formation, maintaining just enough distance to prevent them from jumping to hyperspace. Our plan was simple. Drive them away from any inhabited systems, then destroy them at our leisure." The cantina's noise faded into background static as he spoke. Other patrons, sensing the gravity of his words, unconsciously gave their table a wider berth. The humans led us to an empty system. Dead star, asteroid field, nothing of value. Perfect place for an execution. We moved in for the kill, expecting them to surrender or fight some desperate last stand. Instead, they did something unprecedented. Zethkar's claws drummed against the table, a nervous habit he had developed since Kepler Station. They attacked. But sir, 7 ships against your entire fleet? That's suicide. That's what we thought, suicide. Noble but pointless gesture. We were wrong on both counts. His voice grew distant. The first thing you need to understand about humans is that they don't think like us. When we fight to win territory, resources, strategic advantage. When humans fight, they fight to survive. And a species that has evolved under constant threat of extinction develops very different tactics. The Vorthan leaned forward, her training warring with her growing dread. What kind of tactics? Improvisation, sacrifice, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Zethkar's mandibles clicked. Their first ship came straight at us. No evasive maneuvers, no attempt at defense. Just a direct attack run at my flagship. We destroyed it easily, of course. But in those final seconds, they did something that should have been impossible. What? They overloaded their plasma drive and used it as a weapon. The explosion took out 2 of my escort destroyers and crippled a third. In a single suicidal attack, they had reduced my effective firepower by 15%. The implications hung in the air between them. Any military strategist could see where this was leading. The second ship did the same thing, Zethkar continued, and the third, and the fourth, each one trading their lives for damage to my fleet. But not random damage, calculated, precise strikes against specific targets. They were working from a plan. 7 ships, the Vorthan whispered. They planned to sacrifice all 7 ships. No, Zethkar corrected. 7 ships was just the opening move. You see, we had made a fundamental error in our intelligence. We assumed that the ships we were chasing contained the entire human force in the system. We were wrong. The young warrior's scales had gone pale, a sure sign of stress in her species. There were more? The mining station we had come to capture wasn't just a mining station. It was a trap. While we were chasing their sacrificial fleet, the humans were preparing a welcome for us. When we finally destroyed the last of their ships and turned back to claim our prize, we found Kepler Station had been completely transformed. Zethkar closed his eyes, but the memories came anyway. The station bristling with improvised weapons, ore processing equipment converted into massive kinetic cannons, mining charges arranged into devastating explosives, and everywhere the cold determination of creatures who had decided that if they were going to die, they would take as many enemies with them as possible. They turned an entire asteroid into a weapon, he said quietly. 90% of their personnel had remained at the station, building defenses, preparing surprises. They knew we would come. They knew we would bring overwhelming force, and they had decided that overwhelming force wasn't going to be enough. But you won the battle, the Vorthan protested weakly. You took the station. We took a graveyard, Zethkar corrected. Yes, we won. Eventually, it cost us 4 more ships and 3,000 lives, but we won. We secured the station, captured the survivors, and claimed victory. He opened his eyes and looked directly at her. Do you know what the survivors told us when we interrogated them? She shook her head. They told us this was just a test. A single mining station with 200 humans had cost us half our fleet and most of our warriors. They wanted us to imagine what would happen if we decided to attack Earth itself. A world with 8 billion humans, all of them willing to turn their entire planet into a weapon if necessary. The silence stretched between them until it became unbearable. Finally, the Vorthan found her voice. The council was afraid. The council was terrified, Zethkar corrected. And they were right to be. Because the humans at Kepler Station taught us something that changed our understanding of warfare forever. They showed us what happens when you fight an enemy that refuses to be conquered, an enemy that will sacrifice everything, turn everything into a weapon rather than submit. He stood up, his legs unsteady from alcohol and memory. That's why the records end there. That's why humans are now protected. Because the Galactic Council realized that some species are too dangerous to fight, even if you can win. The Vorthan looked up at him with something approaching horror. Too dangerous? Victory has a price, Zethkar said softly. And sometimes that price is higher than anyone should be willing to pay. The humans taught us that at Kepler Station. They taught us that there are some enemies you defeat not by conquering them, but by learning to leave them alone. As he walked away, he could hear her whispered question following him into the night. What could be more dangerous than an enemy you can't defeat? The answer he knew was an enemy you could defeat, but only by becoming something worse than they were. A week passed before Zethkar saw the Vorthon again. This time she wasn't alone. 3 other young warriors sat with her at a table near the cantina's entrance. Their conversation hushed but intense. When she spotted him, she approached with obvious nervousness. "Sir, I hope you don't mind, but I've told my squad mates about our conversations. They have questions." Zethkar studied the group. A draconian female with the ritual scars of a shock trooper, a mechanoid whose optical sensors flickered with curiosity, and a Zephyrian whose feathers betrayed his anxiety through their constant color shifts. All young, all eager, all about to have their worldview shattered. Questions? He settled into his chair, noting how they unconsciously arranged themselves in a defensive formation around the table. "What kind of questions?" The Draconian spoke first, her voice carrying the aggressive confidence of her people. "We've been researching human military history since our colleagues shared your stories. Their record doesn't match your assessment. They've been engaged in constant warfare for their entire recorded history, but they've never demonstrated the kind of tactical brilliance you describe." Zethkar's laugh was dark. "Have you looked at their conflicts with each other?" "Primitive tribal warfare," the mechanoid interjected, its synthetic voice precise and dismissive. "Resource competition over territorial boundaries. Nothing that would indicate advanced strategic thinking." "Primitive," Zethkar repeated. He signaled the bartender for drinks all around. "Tell me, how many of your species' wars lasted for multiple generations?" The question hung in the air. Galactic warfare was typically swift and decisive. Superior technology or numbers determined outcomes within months, sometimes weeks. The idea of conflicts stretching across decades was almost unthinkable. "The humans have a saying," Zethkar continued. "The phrase translates roughly as total war. Do any of you know what that means?" The Zephyrian's feathers shifted to deep purple, indicating confusion. "Complete mobilization of military resources?" "More than that. Total war means that every citizen becomes a combatant. Every factory becomes a weapons manufacturer. Every resource becomes a tool of warfare. The distinction between military and civilian targets disappears entirely." Zethkar's claws traced patterns on the table. "Most species fight wars to achieve specific objectives. Humans fight wars to erase the enemy's capacity to threaten them ever again." The Draconian scoffed. "That's impossible. No species could sustain that level of commitment. The economic cost alone would destroy their civilization." "Would it?" Zethkar asked. "During their second global war, humans converted their entire industrial base to military production in less than 2 years. Their civilian population accepted rationing that would cause riots on most worlds. They worked 20-hour shifts in factories while their cities burned around them. And they did this for 6 years straight." The young warriors exchanged glances. The mechanoid's optical sensors focused intently on Zethkar. "If this is accurate, why did our intelligence services classify them as non-threatening?" "Because intelligence services look for things they understand," Zethkar explained. "They look for traditional military infrastructure. Standing armies, weapons platforms, organized command structures. What they don't look for is the capacity to create these things overnight from civilian resources." He took a drink, gathering his thoughts. The memories of Kepler Station were clearer now, sharpened by repetition. "Let me tell you about the first human ship that attacked us. A converted cargo hauler called the Thunder Bay. 20 years old, held together with improvised repairs, crew of 30 miners and engineers." "A civilian vessel," the Vorthon said quietly. "Officially, but in the 3 days between our arrival and their attack, they had converted it into something else entirely. They stripped out the cargo hold and filled it with mining explosives. They rerouted life support to boost shield power. They welded kinetic mining equipment onto the hull and called it weapons." The Zephyrian's feathers had turned white with shock. "They weaponized a cargo ship in 3 days?" "Not just weaponized. They created a vessel specifically designed to damage ships like mine. They studied our hull composition from long-range scans and configured their explosives accordingly. They analyzed our shield harmonics and tuned their kinetic weapons to exploit weaknesses. In 3 days, civilian miners became military engineers." "But that's impossible," the Draconian protested. "Military-grade modifications require specialized knowledge, equipment, materials. Military-grade modifications require military thinking," Zethkar interrupted. "But humans don't think in terms of military and civilian applications. They think in terms of solving problems. The problem was how to damage a Krillian heavy cruiser with limited resources. They solved it. The mechanoid processed this information with visible agitation, its optical array cycling through different spectrums. This suggests a level of adaptability that exceeds normal parameters. How widespread is this capability? Universal, Zethkar said simply. Every human colony we've observed demonstrates the same pattern. When threatened, they transform their entire society into a weapon, not just their military, their entire civilization. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. At Kepler Station, we fought miners, engineers, technicians, even children old enough to carry tools. Every single human on that station became a combatant. The cooking staff built incendiary devices. The medical team created biological weapons from mining bacteria. The children served as communications runners through maintenance shafts too small for my warriors to follow. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant hum of the station's life support systems. Around them, other conversations had stopped. The cantina's regular patrons, those who had heard enough war stories to recognize truth, listened with growing unease. How do you defeat an enemy like that? The Vorthan asked. You don't, Zethkar said, not without becoming something worse than they are. To truly defeat humans, you would have to be willing to destroy entire worlds without exception. Every man, woman, and child. Every city, factory, and farm. You would have to commit genocide on a scale unprecedented in galactic history. The draconian's scarred face had gone pale. Surely no species would go that far for conquest. Conquest? Zethkar shook his head. You still don't understand. It wouldn't be conquest. It would be survival. Because once you start a war with humans, they will never stop fighting. They will never surrender. They will never accept defeat. They will spend generations, centuries if necessary, building their strength and planning their revenge. He stood up slowly, the weight of memory making him feel far older than his cycles. The humans at Kepler Station didn't just fight us. They studied us. They learned our weaknesses, our tactics, our psychology. The survivors we captured weren't broken prisoners. They were intelligence agents gathering information about their enemy. For what purpose? The mechanoid asked. So that the next time we meet, they'll be ready, Zethkar said. Every engagement with humans is also a learning experience for them. They adapt, they improve, they share information across their entire species. Fight them once and you've trained them to fight you better the next time. The young warriors sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. War, as they understood it, was a competition between military forces. What Zethkar was describing was something entirely different, a form of conflict that had no clear beginning or end, no distinction between combatant and civilian, no possibility of clean victory. This is why the Council classified them as protected, the Vorthan said finally. This is why the Council was smart enough to step back before it was too late, Zethkar confirmed. The humans offered us a choice at Kepler Station. Fight them and win at a cost that would destroy us both, or find another way to coexist. He looked around the table at their young faces, seeing his own lost innocence reflected there. The universe is full of species who can be conquered, resources that can be claimed, territories that can be dominated. But humans taught us something that every warrior needs to understand. Sometimes the greatest victory is knowing when not to fight. As he walked away, leaving them to contemplate his words, Zethkar reflected on the bitter irony. He had come to this cantina to drown his memories in alcohol. Instead, he found himself preserving them, passing them on to the next generation. Perhaps that was what the humans had intended all along. Perhaps letting him survive hadn't been mercy at all, but strategy. After all, what better way to discourage future conflicts than to have a respected enemy warrior spread the word about the true cost of fighting humanity? The thought followed him into the darkness of the station's corridors, where his footsteps echoed like whispers of wars that might have been. 2 weeks had passed since Zethkar's last visit to the cantina, but news traveled fast through the station's networks. Word of his stories had spread beyond the young warriors, reaching the ears of mercenary captains and veteran soldiers. When he finally returned, he found a different atmosphere waiting for him. The usual crowd had changed. Fewer civilians, more military types. Conversation stopped when he entered, and eyes followed him to his corner table. The bartender approached immediately, setting down his usual drink without being asked. On the house tonight, the Nexian said quietly. Captain Thorax wants to buy you around. So does Commander Vale. Actually, half the cantina wants to buy you drinks. Zethkar surveyed the room, noting the mix of species and ranks. What do they want in return? To hear about the humans. Word is spreading that you're the only one who'll tell the real story. The bartender's forearms gestured nervously. Some of them have contracts coming up. Outer Rim territories, places where they might encounter human settlements. Before Zethkar could respond, a massive figure approached his table. Captain Thorax, a Gorlak mercenary whose reputation for brutality was matched only by his tactical brilliance. The creature's thick hide bore scars from dozens of campaigns, and his small eyes held the cold intelligence of a born predator. Mind if I join you, veteran? Thorax's voice rumbled like distant thunder. Zethkar gestured to the empty chair, though it creaked ominously under the Gorlak's weight. I assume you want to hear about Kepler Station, among other things. Thorax signaled for drinks. My outfit has a contract to clear pirates from the Vega corridor. Intelligence suggests some of them might be human refugees from the protected zones. Refugees, Zethkar repeated. Is that what they're calling them now? What would you call them? Zethkar considered the question carefully. Advance scouts. Reconnaissance teams. The first wave of something larger. He met the Gorlak's gaze directly. Humans don't become refugees, Captain. They become problems for whoever forced them to leave home. Thorax's laugh was like grinding stone. They're just pirates, scavenging in dead systems, raiding supply convoys. Nothing my ships can't handle. How many ships do they have? Intelligence estimates 12 to 15 vessels. Modified civilian craft, mostly. Nothing larger than a frigate. Zethkar's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. And how many ships are you bringing to this engagement? 23 vessels, including my flagship. All military grade, properly armed and shielded. Thorax's confidence was absolute. Its overwhelming force. Standard pirate suppression. Standard, Zethkar echoed. He took a long drink, watching as other patrons gradually moved closer to their table. Tell me, Captain, what do you know about human piracy? Same as any other species. They attack weaker targets, avoid strong ones, run when confronted with superior force. Wrong on all counts. Zethkar's voice cut through the cantina's noise. Human pirates don't follow standard patterns because they're not really pirates. They're exiles, survivors. People who have lost everything and decided that if they're going to die anyway, they might as well take some enemies with them. He leaned forward, his scarred features intense in the dim light. After Kepler Station, I made it my business to study human warfare. Not just their military actions, but their entire approach to conflict. What I found changed everything I thought I knew about combat. The cantina had gone quiet now, conversations dying as beings strained to listen. This was what they had come for. Information that might keep them alive. Humans don't have a warrior caste, Zethkar continued. They don't have professional soldiers in the sense that we understand them. Every human is a potential warrior. Every civilian knows how to fight, how to build weapons, how to turn everyday objects into tools of war. Thorax snorted dismissively. Civilian fighters are no match for trained military personnel. Civilian fighters, no. But humans blur that distinction. When they're forced into piracy, they don't just steal cargo. They study their targets. They learn ship designs, weapon systems, defensive patterns. They turn every raid into a training exercise. Zethkar's claws drummed against the table as memories surfaced. During my research, I found records of a human pirate group in the Proxima system. 37 vessels attacking merchant convoys. Standard suppression fleet was dispatched. 200 ships, including 3 heavy cruisers. What happened? Someone called from the crowd. The pirates vanished. Every ship, every crew member just disappeared into the asteroid fields. The suppression fleet spent 3 months searching, finding nothing but empty space and the occasional debris field. Thorax was listening intently now, his mercenary instincts recognizing a tactical puzzle. They ran, abandoned the system. That's what the fleet commander thought, until the asteroid started moving. The silence in the cantina was complete now. Even the background hum of life support seemed to fade as every being in the room focused on Zethkar's words. The humans had spent those 3 months turning the asteroid field into a weapon. They hollowed out rocks, filled them with explosives, created mobile weapons platforms that looked like natural debris. When the suppression fleet finally decided to withdraw, thinking their mission accomplished, the asteroids attacked. Asteroids can't attack. The mechanoid from his previous conversations protested from across the room. These could. The humans had rigged them with improvised thrusters, guidance systems built from salvaged ship components. They turned an entire asteroid field into a massive minefield that could hunt its targets. Zethkar's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the cantina, every word carried clearly. 97 ships were destroyed in the first wave. The remaining vessels tried to retreat, but the humans had planned for that too. More asteroids waited along every escape route. By the time it was over, 12 ships out of 200 had survived to tell the story. Impossible, Thorax growled, but his voice lacked conviction. Improbable, Zethkar corrected, but entirely within human capabilities. You see, what you call piracy, they call survival, and humans have turned survival into an art form. He stood up, addressing the entire cantina now. Every species in this room evolved on a world where they were the dominant predator. Humans didn't. They evolved on a death world where everything was trying to kill them. They survived by being smarter, more adaptable, more ruthless than anything they faced. So what are you saying? Thorax demanded. That we should avoid human space entirely? I'm saying you should understand what you're facing before you engage. Zethkar's gaze swept the room, taking in the mixed crowd of warriors, mercenaries, and soldiers. When you fight humans, you're not fighting a military force. You're fighting a species that has spent millions of years learning how to kill things bigger, stronger, and more numerous than themselves. A Vorthon officer near the bar spoke up, but surely with proper intelligence and overwhelming force. Overwhelming force is what the Proxima suppression fleet thought they had, Zethkar interrupted. It's what we thought we had at Kepler Station. Humans have a different definition of overwhelming. To them, overwhelming force means being willing to sacrifice everything to achieve victory. He moved toward the cantina's exit, then paused. Captain Thorax, you asked for advice about your mission. Here it is. Don't think of those pirates as criminals you're hunting. Think of them as advanced scouts for an invasion you haven't recognized yet. Invasion? Thorax's voice carried a note of concern that hadn't been there before. Humans don't expand like other species. They don't conquer territory and hold it with military occupation. They send out small groups that look harmless, that seem to pose no threat. These groups establish themselves, learn about local conditions, and gradually blend into the existing population. Zethkar's scarred features were grim in the cantina's lighting. By the time you realize what's happening, it's too late. The invasion isn't coming from outside. It's already there, growing from within. But these are just pirates, someone protested. Refugees driven from their homes. Refugees who know how to turn asteroid fields into weapons. Refugees who can modify civilian ships into warships overnight. Refugees who view every engagement as a learning opportunity. Zethkar's voice carried the weight of hard-won knowledge. Tell me, what do you think those refugees are learning about galactic military tactics while you're hunting them through the Vega corridor? The question hung in the air as Zethkar left the cantina. Behind him, the conversations that resumed were quieter, more thoughtful. Plans were being reconsidered. Strategies were being questioned. In his quarters later that night, Zethkar stared out at the stars and wondered if he was doing the right thing. Each story he told spread a little more fear, a little more caution throughout the galaxy's military community. Perhaps that was exactly what the humans wanted. Perhaps they had counted on him surviving Kepler Station specifically so he could serve as their unwitting herald, preparing the galaxy for their eventual return. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a strange sense of admiration. Even in defeat, even in exile, the humans were still thinking 3 moves ahead. It was, he reflected, exactly what he would expect from a species that had survived by being smarter than everything that tried to kill them. The message reached Zethkar 3 days after Captain Thorax departed for the Vega corridor. It was brief, coded in military cipher, and marked with the highest priority designation. When decoded, it contained only a single line. Request immediate consultation regarding human combat doctrine. Captain Thorax, Gorlak Mercenary Fleet. Zethkar stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. He had seen this pattern before. Military leaders who dismissed his warnings, only to call for help when they encountered the reality of human warfare. Usually by then it was too late. He was contemplating whether to respond when a commotion in the cantina's main room drew his attention. The Vorthon recruit was there, but she wasn't alone. A crowd had gathered around her table and their conversation was animated, almost heated. Telling you the reports are being suppressed, she was saying as Zethkar approached. 3 separate engagements in the past month, all classified at the highest levels. What engagements? The question came from a Draconian fleet commander whose ornate uniform marked him as nobility. Vega Corridor, Centauri Outskirts, and the Helix Nebula, all listed as routine pirate suppression missions, all resulting in massive casualties. Zethkar settled into an empty chair at the edge of the group, noting how the conversation paused when they noticed him. How massive? He asked quietly. The Vorthon scales had lost their luster entirely. Vega Corridor, 80% casualties. Centauri, complete loss of contact. Helix, 3 survivors out of 47 ships. 3 survivors, someone repeated in a hollow voice. All suffering from severe psychological trauma. The Vorthon continued, classified as unfit for active duty. Their debriefing reports are sealed. The Draconian commander leaned forward aggressively. Even if these reports are accurate, they prove nothing. Pirates get lucky sometimes. Ambushes happen. It doesn't mean what? Zethkar interrupted. That the humans are back? The cantina fell silent. The question that had been lurking beneath every conversation, every worried glance, was finally out in the open. They can't be back, a mechanoid officer stated flatly. The treaty specifically confines them to their home system. Any violation would trigger immediate military response. What treaty? Zethkar asked. The question seemed to confuse them. The mechanoid's optical sensors cycled through different spectrums as it processed the implications. The containment protocols established after Kepler Station. I was at Kepler Station, Zethkar said slowly. No treaty was signed. No protocols were established. The human survivors were simply released and told to return to their home system. But the Council's records say whatever the Council wants them to say. Zethkar's voice carried the weight of bitter experience. Tell me, has anyone actually verified that the humans stayed in Sol space? The silence that followed was answer enough. We assumed, the Draconian admitted reluctantly. With their technological limitations, they couldn't possibly have spread beyond their local systems without our knowledge. Assumptions, Zethkar repeated. The same assumptions that cost me most of my fleet at Kepler Station. He stood up, addressing the entire room. How many of you have encountered unusual pirate activity in the past year? Tactics that didn't match standard patterns? Technology that seemed too advanced for typical raiders? Hands and appendages rose throughout the cantina. More than half the room. Modified weapons that shouldn't have been possible with available resources? More hands. Coordinated attacks between groups that should have been competitors? Even more. Complete disappearances of ships that should have been too large to hide? By now, nearly everyone in the cantina was participating. The pattern was clear and it was disturbing. They're not pirates, Zethkar said simply. They're colonists, explorers, advanced teams establishing footholds throughout the galaxy. But that's impossible, someone protested. We would have detected their ships, their settlements, and would you? Zethkar's laugh was bitter. How do you detect a settlement that looks like a mining operation? How do you track ships that appear to be converted cargo haulers? How do you monitor a species that has mastered the art of hiding in plain sight? The Vorthon's voice was barely a whisper. How long have they been out there? Since Kepler Station, Zethkar said. Maybe before. The survivors we released weren't defeated enemies returning home. They were intelligence agents reporting back to their superiors. Every weakness they observed, every tactical doctrine they learned, every ship design they studied, all of it was data for future operations. The implications hit the room like a physical force. Conversations erupted as beings realized what they were hearing. The humans hadn't been contained. They had been learning, adapting, spreading. This is speculation, the Draconian commander said, but his voice lacked conviction. Paranoid theories based on coincidence and fear. Is it? Zethkar activated his personal communicator and projected a holographic display. 3 months ago, I started tracking unusual incidents throughout the galaxy. Ship disappearances, technological anomalies, tactical innovations that didn't match any known species' capabilities. The display showed a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy, with incident markers scattered across dozens of systems. At first glance, they appeared random. But as Zethkar manipulated the display, patterns emerged. Notice anything? He asked. The mechanoid spoke first, its analytical processors identifying the pattern immediately. The incidents form expansion vectors radiating outward from Sol space. The temporal distribution suggests coordinated deployment over an 18-month period. Coordinated deployment, Zethkar repeated. Not random piracy. Not coincidental encounters. A planned expansion using tactics specifically designed to avoid detection by galactic authorities. The room erupted in shocked conversations. Fleet commanders were accessing their personal communications, calling for updated intelligence reports. Mercenary captains were calculating the implications for their current contracts. Everyone was suddenly very aware that the galaxy might not be as safe as they had believed. But what do they want? The Vorthon asked desperately. If they're expanding, if they're establishing colonies, what's their objective? Zethkar considered the question carefully. Survival, he said finally. Humans don't think in terms of conquest or empire. They think in terms of ensuring their species' continued existence. Every colony they establish is a backup plan. Every outpost is a potential refuge. They're not trying to rule the galaxy. They're trying to make themselves impossible to eliminate. That's... The Draconian searched for words. That's actually rational. Logical even. Of course it is. Humans aren't monsters. They're just very, very good at survival. Zethkar's expression was grim. Which brings us to the real question, what do we do about it? We report this to the council, someone suggested. Demand a full investigation. And then what? Launch another military expedition to remove them? Zethkar shook his head. How do you fight an enemy that's already dispersed throughout the galaxy? How do you defeat colonies that look like legitimate settlements? How do you distinguish between human outposts and the hundreds of other species operations? The silence returned heavier than before. Everyone in the room was beginning to understand the true scope of the problem. They've already won, the Vorthon said quietly. Have they? Zethkar asked. What exactly have they won? The right to exist? The ability to survive? Is that victory? Or is that just the minimum requirement for any species? He looked around the room at the assembled warriors, seeing his own thoughts reflected in their faces. Fear, yes, but also a growing understanding that the situation was more complex than simple military conflict. Maybe the question isn't how to fight them, he said slowly. Maybe the question is whether we need to fight them at all. The cantina fell silent as beings contemplated a possibility that few had considered, that coexistence might be not only possible, but preferable to the alternative. Outside in the vast darkness between the stars, human ships continued their patient work of building a future that could survive anything the galaxy might throw at them. They had learned the lessons of Kepler Station well. And perhaps, Zethkar reflected, that was exactly what they had intended to teach. The emergency session of the Galactic Military Council convened exactly 1 week after Zethkar's revelation in the cantina. Word had spread through military networks faster than anyone anticipated, reaching high command before official intelligence reports could be prepared. Now, representatives from every major military power in the galaxy sat around a massive conference table, their attention focused on a single scarred Krillian warrior, Admiral Vexithari, Supreme Commander of Draconian Forces, presided over the session with obvious reluctance. Commander Zethkar, these are serious allegations you've brought to our attention. Are you prepared to substantiate your claims about human expansion activities? Zethkar stood at attention, though his posture carried none of the deference typically shown to superior officers. Admiral, with respect, these aren't allegations. They're observations based on 18 months of systematic investigation. Investigation? General Korath, representing the Mechanoid Collective, processed this information with visible agitation. By whose authority? Under what mandate? My own authority, Zethkar replied simply. As a survivor of humanity's initial contact with galactic civilization. The admission caused a stir around the table. Military officers exchanged glances, communicating through a mixture of spoken language and species-specific signals. The implications were clear. If Zethkar was conducting unauthorized intelligence gathering, it suggested official channels had failed to detect a potential threat. Admiral Vexithari activated the room's holographic display system. Present your evidence. Zethkar approached the display controls, his movements deliberate and professional despite the alcohol-induced tremor in his claws. Computer display file designation Zeth Prime 7. The hologram shifted, showing a three-dimensional map of the galaxy with hundreds of incident markers scattered across multiple sectors. The assembled officers leaned forward, studying the data with growing unease. Each marker represents what official reports classify as pirate activity, technical anomalies or unexplained phenomena, Sethakar explained. Individually, they appear random. Collectively, they form a pattern. He manipulated the display, highlighting temporal sequences and connection vectors. Notice the progression. Starting 18 months ago, incidents begin appearing in systems adjacent to Sol space. Over time, they spread outward in organized waves, each approximately 3 months apart. This proves nothing. Admiral Thakfor of the Zephyrian Defense Force interjected, his feathers rippling with skepticism. Correlation does not imply causation. Pirate activity naturally follows trade routes, does it? Sethkar isolated several incident markers. Computer overlaid trade route data for the past 2 years. The display changed, showing the galaxy's major shipping lanes in blue lines. Most of the incident markers were nowhere near established trade routes. These attacks occurred in systems with minimal commercial value, Sethkar continued. Remote locations with limited resources, no strategic importance, and virtually no reason for traditional piracy. General Korath's optical sensors focused intently on the display. What alternative explanation do you propose? Settlement establishment, resource evaluation, infrastructure development. Sethkar's voice was matter-of-fact. The humans aren't raiding these systems. They're colonizing them. Impossible, Admiral Vexathari declared. We would have detected colonial ships, infrastructure development, population centers. Would you? Sethkar changed the display again, showing detailed reports from several incidents. Tell me, Admiral, what's the difference between a human mining operation and a human military outpost? The question hung in the air as officers struggled to formulate an answer. There isn't one, Sethkar said finally. Every human civilian facility is also a potential military installation. Every mining ship can be converted to a warship. Every colonist is trained in basic combat operations. They don't build separate military and civilian infrastructures because they don't recognize the distinction. He pulled up specific incident reports, highlighting key details. System designation Tau 7, pirate attack involving converted mining equipment used as kinetic weapons. System designation Beta 12, technical anomaly where asteroid mining operations suddenly became impossible to detect or track. System designation Gamma 3, unexplained phenomenon where shipping lanes were mysteriously diverted around previously empty space. You're suggesting these are all human activities? General Korath asked. I'm stating it as fact, Sethkar replied. Computer, display intercept data from Kepler station survivors. The hologram shifted to show communication transcripts, partially decoded but clearly showing coordinate references that matched many of the incident locations. These intercepts were captured during the final phase of the Kepler engagement, Sethkar explained. At the time, we assumed they were desperate communications between trapped civilians. Upon analysis, they appear to be intelligence reports being transmitted to predetermined locations throughout the galaxy. The silence in the room was profound. Every officer present understood the implications. While galactic forces had been celebrating their victory at Kepler Station, the humans had been implementing a backup plan that made that victory meaningless. Admiral Vexthari's scales had darkened with stress. How many colonies are we talking about? Unknown. Based on incident patterns, I estimate between 50 and 200 established outposts, with potentially thousands more in development. Sethkar's expression was grim, and that's assuming they're using technology and methods we can detect. This is... General Korath paused, processing calculations. This represents a fundamental intelligence failure of unprecedented magnitude. It represents something else, Sethkar said quietly. It represents exactly what humans told us they would do if we forced them to leave their home system. He activated another display, showing archived footage from Kepler Station. The image was grainy, damaged by combat interference, but clearly showed a human prisoner during interrogation. Subject 23 Alpha, mining engineer Sarah Chen, Sethkar recited from memory. When asked about human intentions if forced from Sol space, she gave a response that was dismissed as typical defiance. Computer, play audio file Kepler interrogation 23 Alpha. A woman's voice filled the chamber, distorted by translation filters but carrying unmistakable conviction. You think you're containing us? You're teaching us. Every system we touch becomes part of us. Every world we leave becomes a seed for our return. You can't contain a species that turns exile into expansion. The recording ended, leaving the council chamber in complete silence. She wasn't threatening us, Zethkar said. She was explaining their strategy. Humans don't fight defensive wars. When threatened with extinction, they transform the threat into an opportunity for growth. Admiral Thekvor's feathers had turned completely white. What do you recommend? Zethkar considered the question carefully. Around the table, some of the most powerful military minds in the galaxy waited for his answer. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same officers who had dismissed his warnings about human capabilities were now asking for his guidance. Reconnaissance, he said finally. We need to understand the full scope of human expansion before we decide how to respond. But more importantly, we need to decide what kind of response is actually possible. You mean military action? General Korath asked. I mean whether military action would accomplish anything other than validating human assumptions about galactic intentions. Zethkar's voice carried the weight of hard experience. Every aggressive move we make teaches them more about our capabilities. Every attack we launch gives them opportunities to adapt and improve. The question isn't whether we can defeat human colonies. The question is whether attempting to do so would create more problems than it solves. The implications were clear to everyone in the room. The galaxy's military forces had spent centuries perfecting strategies for fighting conventional enemies. What Zethkar was describing wasn't conventional warfare. It was something entirely different. Something for which their training and experience had not prepared them. There is another option, Admiral Vexthari said slowly. Diplomatic contact. Zethkar agreed. Communication, negotiation, finding a way to coexist rather than attempting to eliminate each other. The Council will never approve direct diplomatic contact, General Korath observed. The security risks are nothing compared to the security risks of allowing the current situation to continue, Zethkar interrupted. How long before human colonies are established in core systems? How long before their presence becomes impossible to ignore? How long before someone makes a mistake that triggers exactly the kind of conflict we're trying to avoid? The questions hung in the air as the most powerful military leaders in the galaxy contemplated a future none of them had anticipated. Outside the council chamber, the vast machinery of galactic civilization continued its ancient routines, unaware that everything had changed. In the darkness between the stars, human ships continued their patient work, building a future that could survive anything the galaxy might decide to do about their presence. And perhaps, Zethkar thought, that was exactly the point. 6 months after the emergency council session, Zethkar found himself in an unexpected position, sitting across from a human diplomat in the neutral territory of Haven Station. The meeting had taken extensive negotiations to arrange, with both sides agreeing to strict protocols and security measures. What surprised him most was how ordinary the human looked. Ambassador David Park was middle-aged by human standards, with graying hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and worry. He wore simple civilian clothing rather than any formal diplomatic attire, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same conversational tone Zethkar remembered from the Kepler Station prisoners. Commander Zethkar, Park said, extending his hand in the human gesture of greeting. I've heard a great deal about you. Zethkar studied the offered hand for a moment before carefully grasping it with his claw. The human's grip was firm but not aggressive, confident without being threatening. I imagine you have. I've been rather vocal about my experiences with your species. That you have. Park settled into his chair with an easy smile. In fact, I should thank you. Your stories probably prevented a war. Prevented? Zethkar's mandibles clicked with amusement. I thought I was merely describing the inevitability of one. Were you? Park leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. Let me ask you something, Commander. In all your stories about human warfare, about our capacity for violence and destruction, did you ever mention our capacity for peace? The question caught Zethkar off guard. Your capacity for peace? We're here, aren't we? Talking instead of fighting, negotiating instead of destroying each other. Park's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. Despite everything that happened at Kepler Station, despite the fear and mistrust on both sides, we're sitting in the same room trying to find a better way forward. Zethkar considered this. You're suggesting that humans prefer diplomacy to warfare? I'm suggesting that humans prefer survival to anything else, Park replied. Sometimes that means fighting. Sometimes it means talking. We're very good at adapting to whatever the situation requires. And what does this situation require? Park's smile returned, but it was different now, warmer, more genuine. Honesty, understanding, and probably a fair amount of patience while we figure out how to share a galaxy without destroying each other. They talked for hours, covering everything from human expansion patterns to galactic trade agreements. What emerged was a picture far more complex than Zethkar's military mind had initially grasped. The human colonies weren't aggressive expansion, they were insurance policies. Backup plans created by a species that had learned the hard way that survival required redundancy. You see, Park explained, when you live on a world where extinction events happen regularly, you develop certain habits. You spread out. You diversify. You make sure that no single catastrophe can eliminate your entire species. Even if that expansion brings you into conflict with other species, especially then, from our perspective, the Kepler incident proved that contact with galactic civilization was dangerous. We needed to ensure that if humanity was threatened again, we wouldn't be trapped in a single system with no options. Zethkar processed this information, comparing it to his own assumptions. So the colonies were defensive measures. Defensive, yes, but also practical. We're not trying to conquer territory or dominate other species. We're trying to ensure our children have a future, regardless of what happens to any particular world or system. But the way you fight, the total commitment, the willingness to sacrifice everything, that suggests aggressive intentions. Park's expression grew thoughtful. Tell me, Commander, if someone broke into your home and threatened your family, how would you respond? I would fight to protect them. Would you hold back? Would you limit your response to proportional force? Would you worry about the attacker's safety while your children were in danger? The answer was obvious, and Zethkar said as much. Exactly. When humans fight, we fight like our families are threatened. Because usually they are. We don't have the luxury of limited wars or political conflicts. When we're forced to fight, it's because our survival is at stake. This reframed everything Zethkar thought he understood about human military doctrine. You're saying that human aggression is actually a form of defense. I'm saying that human aggression is desperation channeled into strategy. We fight so hard because we can't afford to lose. We sacrifice so much because the alternative is losing everything. The conversation continued as Haven Station's artificial day cycle shifted to evening. Other topics emerged: human technology, their social structures, their approach to resource management. What became clear was that humans weren't the militaristic expansion force that galactic intelligence had feared. They were refugees creating backup plans, survivors building redundant systems, a species that had turned paranoia into a survival strategy. But the intelligence reports, Zethkar said. The modified weapons, the improvised military technology, tools, Park replied simply. We modify everything because we've learned that anything can become a tool if you understand it well enough. A mining laser becomes a weapon when you're threatened. A cargo ship becomes a warship when you need to defend yourself. A civilian becomes a soldier when their family is in danger. And a diplomat becomes a strategist when negotiation serves your species' interests. Park's smile was knowing. Exactly. We adapt to whatever role the situation requires. Right now, the situation requires someone who can help both sides understand that we don't have to be enemies. As the meeting drew to a close, Zethkar found himself reconsidering everything he thought he knew about humanity. The species that had terrified him at Kepler Station wasn't a military threat. It was a survival response. Their expansion wasn't conquest, it was preparation. Their willingness to fight wasn't aggression, it was desperation. What happens now? He asked. Now we try something unprecedented, Park replied. We try to build a relationship between our species based on understanding rather than fear. It won't be easy. There's a lot of mistrust to overcome on both sides. And if it doesn't work, if diplomatic solutions fail, Park's expression grew serious. Then we'll adapt to whatever the situation requires. But I hope it doesn't come to that. Humanity has spent enough time preparing for the worst. I'd like to try preparing for the best. Months later, as Zethkar sat in his favorite cantina watching news reports about the first formal diplomatic agreements between humanity and the Galactic Council, He reflected on how much his understanding had changed. The humans were still dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than he had initially realized, but they were dangerous in the way that any desperate survivor was dangerous. Not because they wanted to harm others, but because they would do anything necessary to protect their own. The young Vorthon who had started this journey approached his table, her scales bright with excitement. "Commander, have you seen the news? The Council has approved formal recognition of human colonies. They're being granted full member status." Zethkar nodded, raising his glass in a silent toast. It was the logical choice. You can't fight an enemy that turns every attempt to contain them into an opportunity to expand. So humanity won. Zethkar considered the question carefully. No one won. But more importantly, no one lost. Sometimes that's the best outcome you can hope for. Outside, in the vast darkness between the stars, human ships continued their patient work. But now they worked alongside vessels from dozens of other species, building a future that could accommodate all of them. It wasn't the ending Zethkar had expected when he first walked into this cantina to drink away his memories. But perhaps, he reflected, it was the ending the galaxy needed. After all, in a universe full of species learning to coexist, the most valuable skill wasn't the ability to fight. It was the ability to adapt.